So hello and welcome. This is the third and last meeting of the Turba online program for spring 2004. Of course, we will be back, so there is no sadness about it. Our Turba as it's secured the support of the Society of the History of Alchemy and Chemistry. And I'm broadcasting this through their Zoom account. With the Umberto's agreement, this will be uploaded and made available on the Shack YouTube channel afterwards. So today we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Umberto Veronesi from Vicarte. He will be talking about the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry, past, present, and ideas for the future. So just a few words about Umberto. Umberto Veronesi is an archaeologist, a heritage scientist based in Lisbon. He specialized in the study of pre-modern technologies with specific interest in metallurgy, glassmaking, and ceramics. Moving between archaeology and history of science, his research explores how people made things and how this process produced knowledge and shaped identities and beliefs. Umberto is currently a research fellow for the class. Please turn off your mics if you can. Or I'm not sure who's just to close the mics of people. Okay, just 1 second. Okay, so just to finish my introduction. So Umberto is currently a research fellow for the project ROMAS at the Vicarte Research Unit, where he investigates the color technology of Portuguese azulejos during a combination of scientific analysis and laboratory replications. So Umberto, at your pleasure, please proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thanks a lot for having me here today. Thanks to everyone also who's here. So I'll share my screen and we can. Okay. Right. So the idea, let's say, for this kind of literature review, which this study ended up being, is, like I said, a literature review on all those works that have been done in the years at the crossroads between archaeology and the history of science. And the excuse for this, which I had in mind for some time and just needed a little kick, was the one-day meeting organized by SHAC, the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, in October 2022. And this meeting was on the theme of archaeology, conservation science, and the history of chemistry. The meeting was preceded and also kind of introduced by an online edited collection of essays that were published on Ambix, the Society's journal, as you know. If you're interested to know a bit more about this topic, this is obviously a good place to start. It's all works published on the journal. And even though that of synergies with material culture specialists is by no means a new theme in the historiography of science, the SHAC meeting was, to the best of my knowledge, really the very first where none of the speakers was a science historian by background. Participants had the opportunity to hear about a number of topics ranging in time and in space, from ancient Egypt all the way to 19th century Edinburgh. Despite being largely unrelated, Such stories were united by the fact that they were told by archaeologists and conservation scientists, and that they were framed within the history of chemistry and chemical technologies. And so I believe that the meeting illustrates very effectively the growing integration of material culture specialisms into the historiography of science. And I also believe it speaks of Schacht's enduring efforts to welcome such integration and encourage cross-fertilization, an effort that is mirrored by the traditional openness of AMBICS towards publishing the work of specialists from material culture-based disciplines. And as it is the case of today's talk, which became an article on this journal, starting from this 2022 meeting, an article that came out last year, and in which I traced the development of what has been termed the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry, selecting a number of examples and discussing the most relevant contributions that this brought to the historiography of science. So I will begin by analyzing how it all started as a subdiscipline of archaeological science, entirely at the beginning, entirely focused on metallurgy, highlighting its substantially innovative effort of looking beyond the immediate disciplinary boundaries of archaeological science. I will then outline the way it developed over time, how it engaged in conversation with some parallel research trends that were gaining ground among historians, and what fresh input this encounter brought to the discourse around the creation and modification of natural knowledge. In the second part of the talk, I will introduce the most recent and current themes, especially in the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry, what's happening now, what's been happening in the last few years, with attention to the shift away from the sole focus on metallurgy and towards other key pre-modern technologies, namely glass technology and the preparation of medicines. I will argue how such broadening of the discipline's scope once again dovetails parallel historiographic interests in a constant feedback cycle. And in the hope of keeping such virtuous circle going, the final section of the talk will provide some ideas for the future of the discipline. I'll suggest promising themes to explore and point out existing archaeological assemblages that have been living at the back of my mind for quite some time now, and that could become arenas for future cross-disciplinary and hopefully collaborative efforts. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry begins when the analysis of materials related with chemical activities starts to be framed within historiographic narratives on the creation and modification of natural knowledge. A sort of premise is offered by the discovery in the 1980s of the 16th century alchemical laboratory of Umberto in Lower Austria. It was not, of course, the first time that remains from a similar context were found and studied, but it was the most comprehensive assemblage recovered from a single coherent site. The first significant opportunity to situate the emerging archaeological story within the larger picture of early modern alchemical practice. Archaeologists discovered what at the time was and still largely is the most complete set of extant laboratory apparatus. The assemblage includes remains of furnaces, scores of ceramic crucibles, and glass distillation equipment employed in what turned out to be metallurgical operations of fire assay and in medical alchemy. An initial report was published on AMBICS in 1993, while a book followed in 1998, both giving ample space to the laboratory's alchemical nature. As we shall see, the archaeology of alchemy at Oberstockstall is still very much alive today, and its importance in the history of the discipline cannot be overstated. Around the same time, the late 90s, Thilo Reren began working at the intersection of archaeology and alchemy, using metallurgy as a point of entry. In Alchemy and Fire Assay, an analytical approach, Reren very much laid the foundations of the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry by expressly engaging archaeological science and the history of science in conversation. Through the analysis of a number of remains related to a goldsmith's workshop, he reconstructed the details relative to the gilding and refining operations carried out at the site. The resulting acknowledgement is that while the aims of alchemists and metallurgists may differ, their tools, processes, and technical knowledge largely overlap, and there exists a constant flow between the two. In the early 2000s, Thilo Reren's student Marcos Martínon Torres gave a decisive push to the discipline. Martínon Torres both benefited from and himself influenced the historiographic interest towards the material culture of chemistry, which was growing rapidly and is well exemplified by the book Instruments and Experimentation in the History of Chemistry, which contains Robert Anderson's seminal chapter on the archaeology of chemistry. First in his PhD, and later in a number of influential articles, Martínon Torres analyzed ceramic crucibles. He especially focused on the crucibles, investigating their production, circulation, and use in metallurgical and alchemical activities. Focusing on assemblages from Oberstockstadt and other early modern sites, his work reveals how the best, most reliable crucibles were invariably manufactured in just a handful of centers in Germany, and how they were exported all over Europe, even reaching the site of early European colonies overseas. Framing his work within the history of scientific instruments, Martínon Torres argues for the key role that such tools, largely overlooked in mainstream historiography, played in the history of chemistry. Their superior quality meant better observations and more reliable quantifications, which in turn pushed the boundary of chemical knowledge and technological innovation. Odd Mongiatti, a student of Martínon Torres's at UCL, and by this time UCL has become a sort of hub of the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry, made a comprehensive analysis of the residues found inside of the Oberstockstadt crucibles, not just from Oberstockstadt, but she especially focused on that assemblage, which again shows the importance of that find. Crucibles and other pieces of apparatus from the site. Integrating archaeological information with the documentary evidence available, her work reconstructs what exactly happened in the laboratory. And it lets us see the rich mosaic of substances that the practitioners manipulated, and tells a compelling story of alchemical secrecy, princely patronage, and a place that was simultaneously business-oriented and a hub of philosophical curiosity and experimentation. Her PhD is really a really interesting piece of work, and I suggest to have a look because it's really well done. The focus on metallurgy served as the core around which the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry formed its identity, as we saw in this brief overview of initial studies, claiming its spot as a branch of archaeological science. The archaeology of alchemy and chemistry shares the same starting point with traditional archaeometallurgical studies. Both begin with broken crucibles, bits of slag, and other residues left behind by metallurgical operations of smelting, melting, alloying, assaying, refining, and so on. The kind of information obtained is also the same, namely the details of those operations, how people made things. Where the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry diverges is in situating those results within different narratives, expanding the disciplinary boundaries of archaeometallurgy to engage in conversation with the history of science. Once this identity was defined, the focus could be broadened to other pre-modern practices that fall within the spectrum of chemistry. Practices towards which, again, historians of science directed a renewed and more material-centered interest. So in 2009, the historian of science Marco Beretta published The Alchemy of Glass, Counterfeit, Imitation, and Transmutation in Ancient Glassmaking. The book charts a history of alchemy told from the perspective of glassmaking and shows how intimately the development of alchemical theories was influenced by contemporary innovation in glass technology. This is another great read, I believe. If, until Beretta's book, mainstream historiography paid surprisingly little attention to the relationship between glass and alchemy, the topic is solidly on the map now, fueled by the increasing interest towards aspects of craft knowledge. I can only cite the many pieces of work done by Sven Dupré, for instance, on this topic. The scientific analysis of the glass equipment recovered in large quantities from Oberstockstall, once again, we come back, unveiled the story of how practitioners source their tools. This is because the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry initially placed the accent on distillation apparatus and on how it was sourced. And it shows how the tools were sourced and how the alchemists selected expensive items for the distillation vessels, items that came from Venice at very high expense and so on, while they chose cheaper products, local glass, local products for non-specialized containers. Quality once more was the main concern when furnishing the laboratory, like we saw with ceramic crucibles. But the interesting thing about glass is that glass is not just a container, it's not just a material for tools, but glass has a lot of different levels intersecting, because glass was also a puzzling and wondrous material, an object of philosophical curiosity. And it was also an extremely valuable technology, an extremely valuable commodity. So we have these many levels. And the experiments carried out at, and now we move, Oxford's Old Ashmolean Laboratory are a testimony to just this intersection of levels. The analysis of the content of some of the crucibles discovered at the site of the first Ashmolean laboratory, at the first Ashmolean museum, revealed an interest in testing new types of glass, transparent glass and colorless glass, among many other things. The Ashmolean findings relate to a period, the late 17th to the early 18th century, of increased philosophical interest around glass, triggered by the introduction of significant element of innovation in glassmaking. For instance, it is around this time that crystal was invented in Britain. This is also the time where the first and most important treatise on glassmaking, full of glass recipes, L'arte vetraia, by the Italian Antonio Neri, was translated into English. And so it's a moment of very lively moment in the history of glassmaking, and also in the attention that natural philosophers had for this material. And in this sense, not only does material culture reflect the interdependence between technology and philosophy, that acts as a connecting thread in Beretta's book. But it unveils this link even further, revealing details on how and on what aspects of the crust process were deemed more interesting to the natural philosophers. For instance, the creation of color in glass, in the glass medium. But another recent trajectory pursued by the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry, like I mentioned before, involves the analysis of those remains related to medical alchemy and related practices. Often in this case, what we have is organic residues preserved in vessels and targeted by very specific types of analysis. And these studies aim to identify substances such as herbs, fruits, seeds, resins, balsams that were worked within them. These are examples taken from these papers that I just showed, showing exactly this kind of materials. Now, these studies, I am not especially, I'm not specialized in this kind of analysis on organic materials. I've only worked on inorganic materials such as metals and glass and pigments, at least some pigments. But I know for sure that once again, there is an overlap between the interest in these materials and in this kind of organic residues and a more generalized interest in archaeological science towards this kind of questions around things such as the reconstruction of ancient DNA, biological archaeology, the reconstruction of diets. So there is always this kind of overlap and interaction of the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry and those who pursue it with an attention to what's being done both by historians of science and by archaeologists too. To reconstruct the details of such chemical activities helps addressing long-standing historiographic interests on issues of medical practices, which in turn can be used to shed light on broader aspects of early modern chemical knowledge. Back to Oberstockstell, the analysis of a fragment of glass distillation vessel, only one fragment, is a case in point for what I just said. And the fragment is what you can see here. The external surface of the vessel is coated with a layer of clay substance, known as lutum sapientiae, the lute of wisdom, which served the main purpose of protecting the vessel from the heat, especially the lower part of the vessel in contact with fire. Yet, the chemical composition of the lute from Oberstockstell, unusually rich in antimony, this particular example here, clearly indicates that function was not the sole driver for the recipe, and that other values were at play. The lute, it is argued, becomes a nexus between material practices and alchemical beliefs around medicine and the body, a microhistory that speaks of the worldviews of its makers and users. This bottom-up approach to widespread chemical practices both contributes to and draws from, again, current trends in the history of science, such as the focus on artisan recipes, from the preparation of food and beverages to the manufacture of drugs, pigments, and cosmetics. Scholarship on recipes argues that knowledge was created and transmitted in contexts such as the household and many other contexts that traditional historiography for a long time ignored. So, as this overview, as this presentation hopefully shows, the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry contributes to some of the most pressing interests among science historians and archaeologists alike. So increasingly sensitive, particularly the science historians, to materials and practices. As more archaeological microhistories get told, the expanding material landscape becomes a way to follow the shifting aims that drove chemistry and dictated agendas across different realities, and to work towards a more balanced history of early laboratories and experimentation. This presentation also argues that historians, archaeologists, and archaeological scientists often explore along similar lines and ask similar questions, but use different sources of information and different frameworks of interpretation. The immediate future, I believe, should see a more solid dialogue between the parts, particularly in the form of direct collaborations to common topics, like, for instance, the example of the Loot of Wisdom paper that you have here, which I worked on together with Professor Stefan Hans from Manchester, the historian of science and art, and it was this encounter, I think, and the combination of the 2 points of view that ended up in an article which I really, really enjoyed and which would never have been the same in terms of its richness and depth if I had to work on it on my own. So I will conclude now by introducing, like I promised, some themes and some materials that may become the base for new, exciting pieces of cross-disciplinary research in the form of collaborations or not. Right. An especially promising topic, and one that is especially dear for me, is certainly represented by the multifaceted relationship between glass and chemistry, which it will largely ignore. Well, not ignore, unexplored. 2 brief examples. The first, the exceptional assemblage of glass distillation apparatus that came to light in the German town of Wittenberg at the site of an alchemical laboratory, which was tentatively linked with the prominent physician and chemist Daniel Sennert. This, well, you can see for yourself, it's really exceptional because it's incredibly rich and incredibly abundant, and we've got lots of pieces which have been reconstructed, as you can see, and also might have some residues in them. So this, the analysis, the study of this assemblage can offer a better understanding of how distillation equipment was produced, a bit like continuing, let's say, on the path of the little work that was done on Oberstockstill, and how it circulated in early modern Europe, and to assess the impact of glass on chemical practices. What kind of glass were they using? For what reason? How did they source their tools? But glass, or glazes in this case, is also a vantage point on the intersection between craft, science, and the market, and on issues of experimental chemistry. Archaeological excavations at the site of the Fulham pottery, run by the chemist John Dwight in the early 18th century, brought to light another exceptional find, a series of test chips which Dwight made while trying to crack the secret of porcelain, following different recipes and experiments. And we have his experiments recorded in the surviving notebooks. Dwight's experimental porcelain was at the same time an economically valuable trade secret and a long-standing alchemical arcanum, but it also provides exciting new paths to chart the development of how laboratory experiments were recorded in early modern Europe. And I will finish this list with my personal favorite, which is the cabinet of John Vigani, first professor of chemistry at Cambridge University. We are at the very beginning of the 18th century. The collection is still preserved in Vigani's original 18th century cabinet and kept at Queen's College in Cambridge. I had the privilege to go see it, and it's just fantastic. The contents of the cabinet, neatly organized in drawers, are incredibly varied. They range from seeds, roots, fruits, animals, resins, shells, fossils, through to minerals, metals, and pigments. You can find a list of if you Google Vigani's cabinet, Queen's College, you will find a list of these drawers. Such concentration of different substances in a single assemblage is quite unique, and it very effectively embodies the complexity of the chemistry phenomenon in early modern Europe. And although some works have in various ways targeted the collection throughout the years, there are a few specific works. A more comprehensive scientific study placing the assemblage within the context of early modern teaching, early modern craft and knowledge lacks. So there are more, of course, ideas for the future, more assemblages out there, and slowly new ones are coming out, and I have to say, new articles are coming out on the topic, but for now, I will leave it at that. For those of you who are interested in exploring the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry further, I have prepared a reading list where you can find all the papers and articles and works cited here, and many more. And yes, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Umberto. This was very interesting and very enlightening. I will ask you to close
yes,
for now, the PowerPoint. That was very helpful in basically marking this, which is a new territory, really. I mean, it's not new, but it is new. And it's a very exciting subject that is coming of age at the moment with the work that you do and other people do. And before I hand out to questions, I was going to ask if you can just briefly say a few words about what you do at the moment. Like, what are your focus and what is your your project at the moment. I mean, obviously the loot was very interesting subject to address. And so what do you do now, or just outline what your thoughts are?
Thanks a lot. Of course. So right now I am part of this project here in Portugal, which in a way it is related to what I've been talking about now, but the focus is quite different. I am based in a department which is more about conservation and restoration archaeological science at this research center called Vicarte, Glass and Ceramics for the Arts. We are specialized in glass and ceramics, both in contemporaneity. We work with a lot of artists, and it's very fascinating, but also in the glass and ceramics as heritage materials. And my project right now is on the Portuguese tiles, because even though Portuguese tiles are, as you probably know, you might have, if you've ever been to Portugal, you probably have seen how important tiles are here, decorated tiles are here. I was very surprised because I wasn't really used to it. They are everywhere. They mark things. They mark train stations. They are used a bit like other forms of artistic expression are used elsewhere, but they are quite unique to Portugal. And it's very much due to the very strong Islamic influence that Portugal had for a long time. But surprisingly, we have no historical accounts, recipes telling us how they were making them, and especially what pigments they were using to decorate the tiles. The sort of golden age of tiles in Portugal is from the late 16th to the 19th century. And for that period, we have no information whatsoever on how they were making. At the same time, the same period in Italy, Maiolica, same technique, painting over glazes. We have recipes, we have people talking about it. In Portugal, nothing. And so this project starts from precisely from this void, and combining the analysis of the chemical analysis of tiles from the National Museum here, but also from sites, various sites, combining the analysis, which gives us a sense of how they are made. We can sort of reverse engineering what pigments they were using with laboratory experiment replications based on recipes that we have from other areas, like in Italy. We are trying to reconstruct this and to write our own, let's say, book of Portuguese recipes. The problem is that very little has been done so far, even in terms of analysis. And so we need a big amount of data, which we are slowly collecting. We've published a couple of things, another couple are in preparation, but this is going to be something that will go beyond the limits of this project, which is, like I was telling you earlier, is about to finish. So this is what I'm working on right now: pigments, colors, and this extremely interesting topic, which has lots of potential chemical links. Although we're not really, unfortunately, we don't have the time to look into it as well, but it would be a very good thing to do, I believe, because again, we are in a kind of technology, high temperature technology, mixing glass, ceramics, colors, and it was the first time for me working on pigments on this scale, and it's been really a source of new knowledge, and I had a really great time. So this is what I'm working at the moment. Mm-hmm. Plus, obviously, finishing things here and there, like the Lutum paper that I had there for quite some time and so on. So I'm still also working in parallel with what I have done for PhD and earlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for talking about your current research, and I noticed that we have already 2 questions, so I will ask Alexander Angerhoff to ask his question first, and then we'll go to Stephen Johnston. So Alexander, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very interesting talk, Umberto. Thank you very much. So I'm curious about the structure of glass and how it developed over time, right? If you look at glass maybe from the Roman times or even older versus more modern glass, maybe in the early modern period, how has glass changed, and how has the stability of glass against heat shock evolved? Because that is obviously a very important property of glass when you think about alchemical processes. Because you put it in the fire, you heat it, you heat the components inside. You don't want it to crack. So how has that changed? Do you have any insight, or can you point us to any literature where that is discussed?
Yes, thanks a lot. This is really an interesting topic, and something that I've been looking into. So glass has been around for an extremely long time. It begins in late Bronze Age in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and then it goes on in the Roman time. There's a massive explosion of glassmaking. And throughout these different periods and different areas, glass was made with different ingredients, with different reagents. Obviously, you need a source of silica, some sand or pebbles or whatever it is. But what really changed, what gave glass its properties for many centuries was the fondant, the sort of the flux you would add, which changed between a natural, a mineral flux rich in salt, to ashes of plants that have been burned and added to the batch. And these were used for lowering the melting point of silica, which otherwise would be too high, but also this gave glass its properties and its chemical composition. And so that's how also we differentiate between different types of glass. Some are rich in sodium, some are rich in potassium, for example. This is maybe the biggest difference that we have throughout history. But the thing is that glass for a long time wasn't really used for, well, for chemical reasons, or at least not to a high degree, precisely because for a long time glass was not so, well, it was, in a way, it was extremely innovative and revolutionary because it allows, like one of the early alchemists of the 3rd century says, it allows to see without touching. So you could see what was going on inside the distillation without, having to poison yourself, basically, or to touch. So that was important. But for a long time, glass was also extremely, the chemical composition of glass didn't allow to do a lot. What really changes the turning point, which is also the moment when, and again, we see like this constant relationship, the moment when distillation and glass, using glass for distillation and distillation as an alchemical practice explodes, is in the Middle Ages, around the 13th, 14th century, partly because glass starts to be made, especially or initially only in Venice, with a new procedure, which was extremely careful and extremely good at purifying the glass, because all the impurities that came with the sand, but especially with the plant ashes, would, one, color the glass, even if very little, but give it some color, which obviously you didn't want, if possible. And two, it would make it more, impurities in the glass means that you also have more points of fragility, and so it could break more easily. And so in Venice, around the 13th century, there's a very good paper on this in the book as well. I hope it's in the reading list. If not, I will write it here. That we can see, really, that glass starts to be made with, it's higher in silica, so it's stronger because silica makes it stronger, but it's also higher in calcium and magnesium, other elements that make it more chemically resistant as well. So more resistant to chemical attack and more resistant to thermal shock. So these are the two things you want from your distillation vessels. This begins around the 13th century, 14th century, and for a while Venice was the place, so much so that you have mentions of Venetian glass in chemical works dealing with distillation. And in Oberstockstall, it's quite interesting because there is a very clear division between those distillation vessels that are very clear, very thin, and the analysis shows that they are either made in Venice or made in imitation of Venetian glass, which became an important industry in Central Europe in the 16th century. This glass made imitating Venetian glass, but extremely high quality. And the other vessels are not. The other vessels are darker, brown. They are dishes, they are bottles, things that you need in the laboratory, but they don't need to be technically advanced, and so you can buy cheaper glass. And then equally good was the Bohemian glass at some point, made in a different way, but still extremely good. And basically, this whole thing of processes of purification, choosing the right raw ingredients, went on until really quite recently, because the final moment of this whole evolution is the invention, but we are already at the end of the 19th century, of borosilicate glass. And borosilicate glass is the glass you find, if you have some dish that goes in the oven and it's made of glass, it's going to be made of borosilicate glass, Pyrex, and so on. It begins at the beginning, around the beginning of the 20th century. And that's the moment when all glass becomes the same. Before that, we have different producers making it differently, and it's more interesting to see how they sort of tried to make glasses that were stronger and stronger, the best they could, of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. That was a very good and very eye-opening history of glass, I think, in a very short time, and I really appreciate it, because I'm also interested in how alchemists saw materials. I mean, what they were doing in the laboratory, and the need for this kind of transparent glass to see what they were up to. I will let Stephen ask his question next. Stephen, good to have you here.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Joe. Hi, Umberto. Nice to see you
Hello.
again.
Hi.
And firstly, just to say thank you for really a really helpful review, especially for someone like me who kind of can only occasionally dip into all these exciting, interesting developments. And if I'm allowed, just to have two questions, in addition to also being greedy and having a snippet in the comments as well, but that's a little totally separate individual thing. So one question was about the review, and it's something that even if I do dip in occasionally to these things, I've been very struck by the Pamela Smith making a knowing project, and using a textual source to then do this experimental work to be recovering techniques in a whole range of crafts and arts. I just wonder, how and if you see that in the narratives and the trajectories that you were talking about. So that's one thing, just about about the story of this as a developing field. And the other one, if I can just blithely carry on, is when you were talking about the story, you had early on the way this was, these developments, looking at the archaeology, being assimilated to the history of science and the history of instruments in particular. And you might expect that, somebody like me, as a curator of scientific instruments, my heart would glow with this. This is a wonderful, great thing to link it together. But I did wonder whether you think there are some risks or some possible distortions there. And would it be better if there was a more developed history of tools, and that looking at this equipment might be better in relation to tools and that kind of craft technology, rather than trying to fit it into a story of history of science and scientific instruments in particular?
Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks for that link. I had no idea about this other cabinet, and I'm looking at it. It's fantastic, really impressive. Very similar to the
It is
Veganic.
very similar to.
Wow! Yes. Similar period as well.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot for this. I will look into it better later, because it's really impressive. But when I said unique, I was ready. Probably it's not going to be. I knew that.
Well, curators are very
nothing is
you know?
unique. There's always something. But, fair enough. So regarding the experimental methods, in the article where I had a bit more space for for talking, I specify that for the purpose of this review and for the purpose of this study here, I had to draw some lines, and the lines I drew in this case was archaeological sites, purely archaeological sites, so done and made by archaeologists, archaeological scientists, or collaborations, but that start with materials archaeologically recovered or from museums and stuff. Because clearly, obviously, yes, I agree with you, the work Pamela Smith has done and the sort of the Pandora's vase she opened is great, and you see this more and more in any project now. You have this parallel work on experimental replications, on recipes, and this is an integral part of this whole thing. But in archaeology, as you probably know, in archaeology, this kind of more experimental bit has been happening and for a long time, because often archaeologists, all they have is, especially if working on prehistory, they don't even have anything written, or they have such small and little evidence that in order to try and shed some light on where they napping flint, you just go and do it and see. It's been done for a long time. And so this is another extremely interesting point of connection between the disciplines. And regarding your second question, I think you're right. I mean, looking at tools in their own right, in a way, would add more interesting, even more new interesting avenues. I just a couple of months ago submitted a proposal here for something that maybe goes a little bit in this direction, because it would be a larger work. Well, not super large actually, because the project is supposed to be fairly short, but like at least the idea would be to look at all laboratory glass in Portugal. We have 3 important laboratories here that have been, well, I'm sure you know them, the one in Lisbon, the one in Porto, and the one in Coimbra, which have been, are very happy stories of musealization as well, and they have important collections. And my idea would be to look at the glass tools, apparatus, analyzing them, exactly arriving to the point when, because they are quite late, they go well into the 20th century. So I would stop when borosilicate glass begins. But it's interesting because it's a history of this, of the tools, precisely like you said, of the tools. There would be a history of science there as well, but it would be more about the history of industry in Portugal and linked with the production or circulation import of specialized tools for these laboratories, which were teaching laboratories at the same time, and so on. So yes, I think it's, I agree. I mean, they have a lot to say, even if they're not looked at necessarily as in the broader picture of the history of science.
Thanks very much.
So I will take Peter's question. I'm mindful of the time, but I think we can go a little bit beyond 7 o'clock if people can stay, because it's such an interesting conversation. So Peter, if you would like to ask a question.
Oddly, it sort of feeds on from Stephen's, because I've just today come back from Texas working with Tiana, who was one of the members of the Making and Knowing project, and rebuild or working with a cupellation furnace. But it brings, so a lot of this is swirling in my head and not particularly structured. But I am aware that there is a definite difference in terms of the archaeology side. Starts from material objects and then ties to reason out from that, whereas the Making and Knowing project focused entirely on the manuscript and then tries to reason out from the textual side. So I'd be interested, Umberto, on your having worked on numerous projects, do you notice that there's a difference or a sort of a disjunction between those two approaches?
Hi, Peter. Thanks a lot. Yes, there is. I've had the chance to work with historians of science and collaborate, and there is a disjunction, and this disjunction will always be there. Of course, it's different ways of approaching, like you said, or starting points. So obviously, what we can't expect to completely, you know, overlap. It would also not be particularly useful. But I think there is often what happens is that I've realized that very often we are looking for the same answer in a way, or looking at the very same things from different perspectives, using different tools. And it's been a discovery for me that I wasn't used to looking at things from a specific perspectives, like the texts, like not just the text itself, because archaeologists have used texts a lot, but in a often a bit of a sterile way, if you want, because it's just, this is what they say and we confirm this rather than, and in this sense, working with historians used to primary sources have really changed opened my eyes on it, because it's not just Theophilus says that you paint in this way. Oh, yes, I see this. Yes, but then the work on primary sources, the work on techniques, craft techniques that I have been exposed to, thanks to collaborating with science historians or just simply you know, following their work, is really stimulating. And even though I know that I won't be able to do the same thing because that's not my background, and that's why I say that work with Stefan, where each does its thing, is maybe the most exciting thing I've worked on so far. And because it was exciting, even though I didn't go into the archives myself, but it was interesting. And I know that pretty much the same thing has happened in the Making and Knowing project, or in the project that you are now working, among the others, with Marcia, who's the head of my department. So yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yes, and thank you, Umberto, for all these interesting thoughts you bring to the table. I mean, I am more on the camp of, collaborating and kind of, let's say, interdisciplinary dialogue. And in a way, I think that's, as you say, it's fruitful. Of course, there is something to be said about the the pure way of doing things, and it's very interesting to follow that kind of path. But also this kind of hybrid way of let's say using recipes, using testimonies, written testimonies, or materials like inscribed materials, or all these kind of elements. I think it also gives a more a certain kind of a value. It's kind of brings a certain kind of complexity, I think, to the look. And I'm just thinking, for instance, with in Oxford, because you have all these crucibles that have been left behind, but you can also connect it to some textual sources. So it's interesting also to place it in that kind of context, of historical context. And I think that in a way that is also, I mean, it brings a new dimension to things. I don't know what you think about that, Umberto. I mean, what did you find that? I mean, when for instance the crucibles were analyzed, they were also. Did you also look at the textual evidence? And they're all kind of evidence, you know. We're all kind of doing a little bit of archaeology, I guess, but maybe archaeology of text rather than archaeology of materials.
No, I agree. I completely agree with you. Even though my background is not there, even though I'm not familiar with going into archives, and I didn't in the end, but I used text where I could for the Ashmolean. There's plenty of texts from those who worked at the Ashmolean, for instance, Robert Plot, Boyle, and the Royal Society, things, you know, people who worked with the Oxford Philosophical Society and so on. And it was a refreshing look for me, because I was so just used to looking at something particular, materials, things, remains, and whatever, that just being able to look at something which gives you a slightly different perspective, but at the end of the day, it's talking about the same thing. It's the same people. It's the same. It's different looks on the same stuff that's going on. Was very refreshing, and I've always tried to avoid just being carried away, like I said before, and just going to the text just because. But I think I've managed to instead find interesting information that would be complementary with the material one, because obviously they are both. They complement each other. They give different perspectives, and everyone with their own limitations. Obviously, I will always be more an archaeologist than anything else. If anything, in these few years, I've learned to speak the language, right? If it makes any sense, but not really that I won't be able to do like a real proper work of historiography.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, someone has just rang my bell several times. But that's I can try and do some of that part as well, and I have, and it's been interesting very much, especially now that we have to work with so this is a whole new dimension, no sources whatsoever here in Portugal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's about the dialogue, I think, and that's also I think the value of creating articles that are in cooperation. You as you were mentioning, having this kind of dialogue and creating output that is combined through the expertise of a archaeologist and a historian. That's I think that's a very valuable thing. And I mean, we should have mentioned also that there's not just text, of course, there's also images or art, for instance,
Yes,
finished product as well. I mean, it's obviously the art part is fascinating as well. But yeah, maybe we can talk about that in another session. For now, I would like to thank Umberto for this very enlightening presentation and great introduction, I think, for for those of us who don't know that much, and also for people that, you know, to draw them into this part of you know, this aspect of alchemy and chemistry that has been rising, and it's so much more important nowadays, the experimental side of things. So yeah, thank you, Umberto, for your
Thanks a lot.
presentation. I look forward to hearing what you're up to in the future. And I will end by saying that this is the last of the turbas for the spring. So it will probably be in autumn that I will try to organize the next sessions. In the meantime, if you have the time to come, I'm co-organizing with John Christie the spring meeting, Shakespeare meeting. It's entitled From Antique to Early Modern Alchemy: New Approaches, New Horizons. This will take place at the Maison Française in Oxford between 28th and 29th of May. I would add that the in-person tickets have been sold out quite quickly, but I would also mention that you can assist hybrid, so that's you know, the thing. If you can make some room for that would be wonderful. We were circulating the program, and there is an experimental. I think there are 2 panels that look at the experimental side of in different time frames. So if you would like to join us for that, that would be wonderful. And again, thank you for participating, and thank you everyone, and have a nice summer if I don't see you. Yeah, I hope you have a great and productive time in the next period. So thank you again, everyone.
A lot.
Good to see you, and thank you for participating. Thank you all.